Where would society be without my boys?
They're the salt of England, Arthur.
Scum, nothing but beggars and scoundrels.
Scum. What a horrible word, but it's a word that is often used to describe the lower ranks of the British Army during the early 19th century. Wellington himself used the word a number of times. But is it fair? Were those soldiers scum? Were they generally king's hard bargain men given the choice between the noose or the army? Zack White, friend of the show now, is probably the expert on crime and punishment in the British Army during this era. He's also the host of the Napoleonic Wars podcast, which I highly recommend. He has very strong opinions on this subject. I started off by asking him, did Wellington really think his men were scum?
Yes, Wellington did believe it. He said it on 4 separate occasions, so there's no escaping that. The apologists for Wellington love to go, oh, he didn't mean it really, it was a backhanded compliment. And it was a backhanded compliment once, where he turns around at a dinner party and goes, you know, we have the scum of the earth as soldiers, and it's remarkable that the army managed to make such fine fellows of them, in that sort of incredibly patronizing tone that you can just imagine Wellington had on occasion. But think about the original quote, the first time he uses this comment.
That after Victoria?
It is Victoria. And everybody thinks, oh, it's about plundering the baggage train after Victoria. It's not. What it's actually about is that a week after Victoria, when the army's moved on, the mayor of Victoria writes to him and goes, look, we're delighted that you've won this battle and you've liberated us from French control. Thank you very much. One small thing, though, we do have a problem with some of your soldiers who are still marauding the countryside, casually plundering the locals. Do you think you could do something about it? Because it's not great for business. And that's when Wellington sits down and he's very angry. He's writing it in a private letter rather than a public capacity, and that's important as well. But he writes to Bathurst and says, it is quite impossible for me or any other man to command a British army under the existing system. We have in the service the scum of the earth as common soldiers. And yeah, he believed that. You know, bear in mind, Wellington's an aristocrat. Of course he believed that. He was going to believe that. So yeah, he might have believed it, but that didn't make it so. Now, there is this facility, as you say, to draft people straight into the army from the courtroom, in fact. So if you look at the Old Bailey records, they have this facility to sentence people to serve in the army for either a set period of time or for more normally for life. The trouble is, most of those get drafted straight into the penal battalions. The penal battalions are generally sent to the West Indies, which is in effect a death sentence in itself because of issues of disease back then. So it's rare for those individuals to then end up in something like Wellington's line regiments, because Wellington's line regiments are generally staffed with recruits from all over the UK. I mean, we know that a third of all men within regiments were actually Irish. So the Irish contingent ends up being a huge part of Wellington's army, even in those regiments that aren't explicitly Irish in their name. Does that mean that you don't have any people from prisons? No, of course not. But prison operates a bit differently back then to how it operates back now. So if you're in debt, you can end up in prison. And we have gentlemen who end up in debt who take their families into prison, because prison is a much more sort of open, a debtor's prison is much more open. You can have your family in there, you can have visitors and all kinds of things. So this idea that, oh, they're all murderers and thieves and the rest of it just doesn't stack up to the reality. The vast majority of his army are labouring classes, people who want a couple of meals a day and a regular wage and think the army is going to provide it, and they're on hard times, there's an economic depression, and so they go join the army. It is not the case that Wellington's army was staffed with the scum of the earth. It's utter crap.
So I think Zack's views are very clear, aren't they? I've also made a video on this subject which you can watch here. I mean, yes, the Redcoats liked to drink, they did sometimes get in trouble, and there were major breakdowns in discipline, such as after the siege of Badajoz, the storming of the city in 1812. But generally these were dedicated, disciplined men who followed orders and were part of arguably the most effective British army ever to take the field.